The hospital called about my best friend. Then I learned I was his emergency contact gay love story. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video from our channel. It only takes a moment, it is completely free, and it is one of the best ways to support us as we continue bringing you more dramatic, heartfelt, and emotional stories like this one. Your support truly means the world to us. And before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. We always love seeing where our viewers are joining us from and how far these stories travel. Thank you very much for being here and supporting the channel. Now, let us return to our main character. Mr. Reed, when Andrew Collins could not speak for himself, he chose you as the person we were supposed to call. Mason Reed would remember that sentence long after he forgot everything else about Thursday night. At 11:38, he had been standing barefoot in his kitchen, eating leftover pizza over the sink, because washing another plate felt like an unreasonable demand from adulthood. Rain tapped against the apartment windows. A basketball game played quietly from the television in the living room. His phone buzzed across the counter with a number he did not recognize. Mason nearly ignored it. Nearly. Hello. May I speak with Mason Reed? The woman sounded calm and professional. Speaking. I am calling from St. Matthew's Hospital. Do you know Andrew Collins? Mason stopped chewing. Nobody called him Andrew. Not his friends. Not Mason. To everyone who mattered, Andrew Collins was Drew. Yes, Mason said slowly. He is my best friend. Is something wrong? The pause lasted barely a second, but Mason felt every fraction of it. The television became meaningless noise behind him. Mr. Collins was brought in earlier this evening after a medical emergency. He is stable and receiving care. Stable. Mason grabbed that word and held on to it. Okay, good. Stable is good. Did you call his parents? They live in Ohio, but I have their number if you need it. We have family information on file, sir. However, Mr. Collins listed you as his primary emergency contact. Mason stared at the rain sliding down the glass. Me? Yes, sir. Are you sure? The question escaped before he could stop it. Of course, the hospital was sure. People did not randomly guess emergency contacts. Still, Mason needed to hear it again. Yes, Mason Reed is the name listed. Something shifted inside him. Drew had parents who loved him. He had coworkers, neighbors, college friends, people who had known him longer than Mason had. Yet when Drew had filled out a form asking who should be called when life became uncertain, he had written Mason. Can I come? Mason asked. Yes. He was already reaching for his keys. 10 minutes later, Mason was driving through wet streets with both hands locked around the steering wheel. He and Drew had been best friends for 11 years. 11 years of coffee runs, football Sundays, terrible road trips, forgotten birthdays rescued by last-minute cupcakes, and phone calls that started with nothing important and somehow lasted 2 hours. But lately something between them had changed. 6 days earlier, they had argued outside Mason's apartment. Drew had accused Mason of disappearing emotionally whenever anything became too real. Mason had responded with the safest weapon he knew: distance. Maybe we should give each other some space, he had said. Drew had gone silent, then answered, if that is what you want. They had barely spoken since. Now Mason was driving toward a hospital because despite that argument, despite the silence, despite Mason pushing him away, Drew had apparently chosen him for the moment when choosing someone mattered most. A red light stopped Mason 3 blocks from the hospital. He stared through the windshield at the blurred glow ahead and whispered the question that would follow him through the rest of the night. Why me, Drew? By the time Mason reached St. Matthew's Hospital, the rain had softened into a cold drizzle, but his thoughts were moving faster than they had during the entire drive. He parked, crossed the nearly empty lot, and stepped through the automatic doors into a lobby washed in pale fluorescent light. Everything smelled clean and faintly like coffee. Somewhere behind the reception desk, a printer hummed as if this were an ordinary Thursday night. Mason envied it. He gave Drew's full name, showed his identification, and was directed upstairs. The elevator ride lasted less than a minute. Felt like 20. When the doors opened, a nurse was waiting near the station. Mason Reed. Yes. How is he? He is stable. His doctor will speak with you shortly. He is resting now. Mason nodded, but his shoulders did not relax. Can I see him? The nurse gave him a reassuring smile and led him down the hallway. Mason had spent 11 years believing Drew Collins was nearly impossible to slow down. Drew worked too much, volunteered to help people move even when nobody asked, drove through snow without complaining, and treated being tired like a minor administrative inconvenience. Seeing him asleep in a hospital bed made Mason stop at the doorway. Drew looked peaceful, which somehow made everything harder. His dark hair was slightly out of place. One hand rested beside him above the blanket. The room was quiet except for the soft sounds of hospital equipment and rain against the window. He needs rest, the nurse said. But you can sit with him. Mason entered slowly and lowered himself into the chair beside the bed. For several seconds, he could not think of anything to say. Then habit rescued him. You know, there were easier ways to get me to answer your calls. Drew remained still. Mason swallowed. That was a joke. Not one of my best. Silence settled again. Mason looked at Drew's hand and remembered another rainy night 9 years earlier when Mason's car had refused to start outside a grocery store. He had called Drew without thinking. Drew arrived wearing sweatpants and house slippers, carrying jumper cables and complaining the entire time. When Mason asked why he had come so quickly, Drew had shrugged. Because you called. Mason had forgotten the sentence until now. A staff member appeared quietly at the doorway carrying a clipboard. She confirmed Mason's phone number and explained that the hospital needed current information for Drew's primary contact. Mason answered automatically until she said, Mr. Collins specifically listed you. Specifically. Mason glanced at Drew. He has his parents on file too, right? Yes. But you are his primary contact. After she left, Mason leaned back in the chair. Primary. First. The person Drew had chosen before anyone else. 6 days ago, Mason had asked him for space. Drew had given it to him without argument. Yet apparently distance had never changed the place Mason occupied in Drew's life. Mason looked toward the door. He could leave now. Drew was stable. The doctors were watching him. There was nothing Mason could do that trained professionals could not do better. He even stood halfway before stopping. 11 years of memories seemed to answer for him. Drew driving 3 hours when Mason needed someone. Drew bringing groceries when Mason had the flu. Drew showing up without asking whether showing up was convenient. Mason slowly sat again. He pulled the chair a little closer to the bed. All right, he whispered. You have spent 11 years showing up for me. His eyes settled on Drew's sleeping face. Your turn to let somebody show up for you. By 1:47 in the morning, Mason had learned 3 things about hospital rooms. The chairs were designed by someone who hated the human spine. Vending machine coffee could somehow taste both burned and watery, and silence became much louder when the person beside you mattered too much. Drew was still resting. Mason sat with the paper cup warming his hands and watched the steady rise and fall of his best friend's breathing. 11 years, he thought. 11 years was a long time to know someone and still wonder whether you had understood the most important thing about them. Mason remembered their first year after college. When he had called Drew after losing a job he had been certain would become his career. Mason had said he was fine. Drew had apparently translated that correctly, because 3 hours later there had been a knock at Mason's door. Drew stood outside holding 2 coffees and an overnight bag. You drove 3 hours because I said I was fine? Mason had asked. Drew had walked past him and replied, You have 2 different versions of fine. That was the bad one. Mason smiled at the memory. Drew knew his coffee order too. Medium roast, 1 cream, no sugar. Mason had never formally told him. Drew simply remembered. He remembered that Mason hated crowded restaurants, that he called his mother every Sunday, that thunderstorms made him sleep better, and that when Mason became nervous, he scratched the edge of his left eyebrow without realizing it. Mason lifted his hand and discovered his fingers there now. Great! he murmured. You would be enjoying this. Another memory surfaced. 2 years earlier, Mason had been sick for several days and opened his apartment door to find grocery bags sitting outside. Soup, orange juice, crackers, medicine, and the ridiculous cinnamon cereal Mason had loved since childhood. There had been no note. There had not needed to be one. Mason knew. Drew never made kindness look important. Maybe that was why Mason had been so good at overlooking it. He treated Drew's presence like electricity in a house. Always there, quietly making life easier, noticed most clearly only when everything went dark. Mason looked toward the sleeping man beside him. How many times did you choose me when I was not paying attention? He whispered. The question frightened him because answers were appearing everywhere. In midnight phone calls, spare apartment keys, long drives, Sunday football games Drew pretended to enjoy even when his team was losing badly. The way Drew always stayed after everyone else went home. 6 days ago, during their argument, Drew had said, I am tired of feeling like I only get the parts of you that do not scare you. Mason had become defensive because Drew was right. Whenever their friendship approached something Mason could not easily define, he made a joke, changed the subject, or created distance. Best friend was safe. Best friend explained everything without requiring him to examine why Drew's opinion mattered more than anyone else's. Why seeing Drew disappointed hurt differently, or why imagining Drew building a life without him created a hollow feeling Mason could never name. He looked at the narrow space between his hand and Drew's on the blanket. Less than an inch separated them. 11 years of evidence seemed to live inside that tiny distance. Mason slowly moved his hand closer but stopped before touching Drew. I think you have been trying to tell me something for a long time, he whispered. Then he looked at Drew's quiet face and admitted the harder possibility. Maybe I have been trying not to understand. At 2:31 in the morning, Drew's phone lit up inside the clear belongings bag on the counter, and Mason learned how quickly 6 ordinary words could turn uncertainty into fear. He had been staring through the rain-streaked window when the brief vibration pulled his attention across the room. The screen glowed beneath Drew's wallet and keys. Mason had no intention of touching it. Then he saw the calendar notification displayed clearly on the locked screen. Friday, 10 o'clock in the morning. Final walkthrough. Rachel Morrison. Mason frowned. Final walkthrough? He whispered. He looked at Drew as if the sleeping man might explain himself. What exactly have you been doing? Mason knew enough about adulthood to recognize the phrase. A final walkthrough usually meant a home purchase was almost complete. Drew had never mentioned buying a place. He had never mentioned moving either. That realization landed harder. For months, Drew had complained that his apartment felt temporary. He had talked about wanting more space, a quieter neighborhood, maybe even a backyard someday. Mason had listened without really listening. Whenever Drew spoke about the future, Mason had treated it like casual conversation because asking where Mason fit into that future felt dangerous. Now the answer seemed obvious. Maybe he did not fit at all. You are moving, Mason said quietly. Saying it aloud made his chest tighten. He immediately felt foolish. Drew could be buying something nearby. The appointment could mean almost anything. But Mason's mind had already started building the worst possible version. Drew in another city. Drew finding new routines, new friends, a new favorite coffee shop. Drew eventually calling less because life had become busy. Mason, becoming someone Drew used to know well. 6 days ago, Drew had stood outside Mason's apartment and said, I cannot keep waiting for you to decide whether I belong in your life. Mason had answered by asking for space. Maybe Drew had finally decided for him. Mason returned to the chair and stared at the floor. That would be fair, he admitted. I would hate it, but it would be fair. The truth surprised him. He had always assumed Drew would be there. Friday nights, Sunday games, birthday dinners, emergency car problems, bad days that ended with takeout at Mason's kitchen counter. He had treated those moments as permanent because imagining their absence required admitting how much they mattered. Mason looked at Drew again. I thought being afraid to lose you was normal best friend stuff. A tired laugh escaped him. Apparently, I have been doing a lot of creative accounting with my feelings. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The hospital room felt smaller now. If you are leaving, I am not going to ask you to stay just because I finally figured myself out at 2:30 in the morning. His voice softened. You deserve whatever life makes you happy. That sentence hurt, but it also felt true. Loving someone, whatever that word meant between them, could not mean keeping them close simply because distance frightened you. Mason looked at the phone until its screen went dark again. But when you wake up, I am going to ask you about that appointment. He paused. And I am going to tell you why the idea of you leaving scares me this much. For the first time all night, Mason stopped searching for a safer explanation. He reached toward Drew's hand and gently rested his fingers beside it. I just hope I did not wait until you were already walking away. By 4 in the morning, the rain had stopped, leaving tiny silver drops clinging to the hospital window while the city beyond it remained dark and quiet. Mason had stopped checking the time because every minute seemed to move differently in that room. Drew was still resting, his breathing steady, his hand close enough that Mason could reach it without leaving the chair. The vending machine coffee on the table had gone cold. Mason took one sip anyway and immediately regretted it. You owe me decent coffee after this, he told Drew. And breakfast. Somewhere with actual pancakes. Not the frozen kind you pretend are acceptable. Drew gave him nothing. Mason smiled faintly. You would argue with me about that. He set the cup down and leaned back. For years, Mason had imagined love as something obvious. Big declarations. Perfect dates. The kind of moment where music should somehow start playing even though nobody knew where it was coming from. Maybe that was why he had never recognized what had been happening directly in front of him. Drew had never arrived with fireworks. He arrived with jumper cables. He brought soup when Mason was sick. He remembered coffee orders, difficult anniversaries, and which grocery store carried Mason's favorite cereal. When Mason lost his job, Drew drove 3 hours because he heard something wrong in 2 words over the phone. When Mason's mother needed help moving furniture, Drew gave up an entire Saturday without being asked twice. None of those moments had looked dramatic enough to be called love. Sitting beside Drew now, Mason wondered why love had ever needed to look dramatic at all. He carefully placed his hand over Drew's. The contact was simple, warm, familiar. I think I finally understand what you were angry about, Mason whispered. You kept showing me that I mattered, and every time you asked whether you mattered too, I gave you a joke. His throat tightened. Or I changed the subject. Or 6 days ago, I asked you to leave me alone. Mason stared at their hands. That was not because I wanted less of you. It was because I wanted more, and I did not know what to do with that. Saying it aloud did not cause the room to collapse. Nothing dramatic happened. The machines continued their quiet rhythm. Somewhere in the hallway, a cart rolled past. Mason almost laughed at how ordinary the world remained after he finally admitted something that had frightened him for years. I love you, he said softly. The words were quieter than he expected. I do not know exactly when friendship became something more. Maybe there was no single moment. Maybe it happened in 1,000 small ones. Mason gently tightened his hand around Drew's. And if you wake up and tell me I misunderstood everything, I will survive the embarrassment. I will still be your friend. I will still want you to be happy. He paused, thinking about the notification on Drew's phone. Even if that happiness takes you somewhere else. That was the part Mason needed to understand. Love could not be a demand disguised as devotion. If Drew wanted another city, another home, another future, Mason would not turn his fear into a cage. He would tell the truth and let Drew choose freely. Mason looked toward the window where the first suggestion of morning softened the black sky. But whatever happens next, you will never have to wonder whether you mattered to me. His thumb moved gently across Drew's knuckles. You always did. I was just late learning how to say it. The sky outside had begun turning pale gray when a hospital staff member entered with a clipboard and asked Mason to verify Drew's contact information. Mason carefully released Drew's hand and sat straighter. He confirmed his full name, phone number, and relationship to Drew. Best friend, Mason said, though the words felt different now. The woman checked the form. Thank you. Mr. Collins updated this information 6 days ago. So I just need to confirm that everything is still accurate. Mason froze. 6 days ago? Yes. She glanced at the page again. Your information was added as his primary emergency contact 6 days ago. Mason stared at her. 6 days. Not months ago. Not before their argument. 6 days ago was the night Mason had stood outside his apartment and told Drew they needed space. Do you know what time he updated it? Mason asked. I am sorry. I only have the date here. That is okay. Mason barely heard himself. He confirmed the remaining information, thanked her, and waited until the door closed. Then he turned slowly toward Drew. You did this after our fight. The realization moved through him with almost physical weight. Mason had spent the night believing the emergency contact form was evidence from some easier version of their friendship, a decision Drew had made before everything became complicated. But Drew had chosen him on the very day Mason pushed him away. Mason remembered the argument clearly. Drew standing beneath the hallway light. The disappointment in his expression when Mason said they needed distance. Drew had not shouted. He had simply nodded and said, if that is what you want. Mason had mistaken quietness for surrender. Apparently Drew had walked away, gone home, and still made Mason the person to call if life became uncertain. Why would you do that? Mason whispered. He leaned forward again. I hurt you. I made you feel like you did not belong in my life, and you still trusted me with yours. His eyes burned, but this time he did not look away. Something about the discovery changed the entire night. The question was no longer whether Drew cared. Mason had 11 years of evidence for that. The question was whether Mason could finally become the kind of person worthy of that trust. I cannot undo what I said, he told Drew, and I am not going to pretend one confession fixes 11 years of hiding behind jokes. Mason placed his hand gently over Drew's again. But if you give me the chance, I can do better from here. Morning light slowly filled the room. Mason thought about the final walkthrough notification and the future Drew might already be building. Whatever that future looked like, Mason would not ask Drew to make it smaller for him. He would only ask for the chance to be honest about wanting a place in it. When you wake up, I am going to tell you everything, Mason said. No jokes. No changing the subject. No asking for space because I am scared. He gave a tired smile. You are probably going to enjoy watching me suffer through an emotionally mature conversation. Mason waited for the silence he had grown accustomed to. Instead, something moved beneath his hand. He stopped breathing. Drew's fingers shifted slightly against his palm. Mason stared down, afraid hope had created the movement. Drew, he whispered. For a second, nothing happened. Then Drew's fingers slowly curled around his. Mason leaned forward, every other thought disappearing. Drew, I am here. This time, the hand. Holding his tightened again. Drew's fingers tightened around Mason's hand once more, and this time Mason knew he had not imagined it. He reached for the call button without letting go. Drew, stay with me. I am right here. A nurse arrived quickly, followed moments later by the doctor. Mason stepped aside only when asked, standing near the window while they checked Drew and spoke to him in calm voices. The morning light had grown brighter, turning the rain clouds outside silver. Then Drew slowly opened his eyes. His gaze moved around the unfamiliar room before finding Mason. He stayed there. Mason forgot every speech he had practiced during the night. Drew blinked, looked at him for another long second, and spoke in a tired voice. You stayed. Mason let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Apparently I am terrible at following my own request for space. The corner of Drew's mouth lifted slightly. I noticed. That tiny response felt more reassuring than anything Mason had heard all night. After the doctor finished checking him and explained that he needed to rest, Mason returned to the chair. For several minutes, neither man said much. Drew looked exhausted, and Mason was afraid of asking too much too soon. But there was one question he could no longer carry alone. I found out something, Mason said quietly. Drew looked toward him. That sounds dangerous. You made me your emergency contact 6 days ago. Drew's expression changed. He said nothing. Mason continued. That was the same day we fought. Drew looked down at their hands. Yes. Mason swallowed. Why? Drew remained silent long enough that Mason almost regretted asking. Then he said, because being angry with you did not change who I trusted. Mason felt the answer settle somewhere deep inside him. You could have chosen your parents. They live several states away. You have other friends. Ido. Then why me? Drew looked directly at him. Because they know pieces of me. His voice was quiet but steady. You know the whole thing. The good days, the bad ones, the version of me that has everything figured out, and the version that absolutely does not. Mason tried to smile. That second version sounds fictional. Do not ruin this. Mason laughed softly. Drew continued. When something good happens, you are still the first person I want to tell. When something goes wrong, you are the person I want beside me. Even after our argument, that did not change. He paused. Everyone else feels like somewhere I visit, Mason. You feel like home. Mason looked down because suddenly meeting Drew's eyes required more courage than he had expected. All night he had searched for complicated explanations. Habit, friendship, convenience, 11 years of history. Drew had reduced everything to one simple truth. Home. Mason tightened his fingers around Drew's hand. I heard what you were trying to say 6 days ago, he admitted. I just got scared because I knew answering honestly would change things. Drew watched him carefully. Mason took a breath. I do not want less of you. I never did. His voice softened. I wanted more. And I was afraid that wanting more could cost me the friendship I already had. Drew's expression gentled. Mason, let me finish before I hide behind a joke. Drew nodded. Mason looked at him. I love you. I think I have for longer than I know how to measure. I am not asking you to answer right now. I am not asking you to promise me anything. I just needed you to hear the truth while I still had the courage to say it. Drew's hand closed around his. Then hear mine. Mason waited. Drew gave him the smallest smile. You were never the only one who wanted more. For several seconds, Mason could only stare at Drew, wondering how 11 years of friendship could suddenly feel both completely different and exactly the same. You wanted more too? Mason asked. Drew gave him a tired smile. I thought that part was obvious. You were talking to a man who needed a hospital phone call to understand his own feelings. Nothing is obvious to me. Drew laughed softly, then closed his eyes for a moment. Mason immediately regretted making him talk. Rest, he said. We can figure everything else out later. Drew opened his eyes again. There is one thing you should know. Mason waited. I was going to tell you. Tell me what? Everything. Drew nodded toward the clear belongings bag on the counter. Mason followed his gaze and remembered the notification. Friday.
10 o'clock.
Final walkthrough. Rachel Morrison. The fear returned immediately. Actually, that reminds me. I saw something on your lock screen last night. I did not open your phone. What did you see? Final walkthrough. Mason hesitated. I thought you were moving away. Drew stared at him. Then an exhausted laugh escaped him. You spent the night thinking I was leaving town? In my defense, you have been talking about wanting a different place for months. A different place, Mason. Not a different state. Mason blinked. So you are moving? About 4 miles. Mason stared at him. Drew continued. Rachel is my real estate agent. I made an offer on a townhouse. 4 miles from where? From you. The answer landed so gently that Mason almost missed how much it meant. Why near me? Drew raised an eyebrow. We just had an entire conversation about this. I know. My brain is catching up. Drew looked toward the window, where the clouds were beginning to break apart. My lease ends this summer. I got tired of living somewhere that always felt temporary. I wanted a place I could actually build a life around. A decent kitchen. A small backyard. Maybe a dog someday. He paused. And when I pictured staying somewhere for a long time, I realized I wanted you nearby. Mason felt his throat tighten. You were planning all of that before our argument? Yes. And the walkthrough? I was going to ask you to come with me afterward. I thought maybe seeing the place would make it easier to finally tell you how I felt. Mason shook his head, half amazed and half frustrated with himself. So while I was inventing a future where you moved across the country and forgot me, you were buying a house for miles away. Townhouse. This is not the moment for real estate accuracy. Drew smiled. Mason looked down at their joined hands. The night had taught him something uncomfortable about fear. Fear rarely waited for facts. It took empty spaces and filled them with whatever hurt most. Mason had seen 6 words on a phone screen and created an entire goodbye. Drew had seen Mason pull away and feared there might never be room for him. Both of them had spent years protecting themselves from answers they actually wanted. Mason looked back at Drew. We wasted a lot of time being afraid. Maybe, Drew said, but we are here now. Mason nodded. Then I do not want to waste what comes next. Drew squeezed his hand gently. Mason smiled. When you are better, take me to see the townhouse. You want to see it? Absolutely. Somebody needs to make sure your kitchen can handle decent pancakes. Drew laughed again. And after that? Mason looked at him, no joke ready this time. After that, we stop pretending this is only friendship and see what we can build from the truth. Drew's expression softened. I would like that. Mason tightened his hand around Drew's. For the first time since the phone rang, the future did not feel like something waiting to take Drew away. It felt like a door neither of them had been brave enough to open, and now they were finally standing on the same side of it. 1 month later, Mason stood inside Drew's new townhouse surrounded by cardboard boxes, packing paper, and convincing evidence that neither of them knew how to assemble furniture without arguing. Morning sunlight poured through the living room windows and stretched across the hardwood floor. Drew carried 2 coffee mugs from the kitchen and handed one to Mason. 1 cream, no sugar. Mason accepted it. 11 years, and you still remember. Drew looked amused. You say that like your coffee order is classified information. I like feeling mysterious. You own 3 identical gray sweatshirts. Consistency is mysterious. Drew laughed and sat beside him on the couch, one of the few pieces of furniture they had successfully assembled. The past month had been quieter than Mason expected. Drew recovered steadily, the final walkthrough was rescheduled, the townhouse purchase was completed, and their relationship changed without becoming unrecognizable. They still argued about restaurants. Drew still criticized Mason's driving. Mason still sent him terrible jokes during work meetings. But now they said things they once avoided. Missed you. I need you. That bothered me. Stay a little longer. They had learned that honesty was rarely dramatic. Most days it was simply choosing not to hide. Drew reached toward a folder on the coffee table. I almost forgot. I need to finish updating some paperwork. Mason groaned. Nothing says new home like administrative responsibility. Drew opened the folder and began checking information. Mason leaned over, pretending not to be curious, until he saw a familiar line. Emergency contact. Drew picked up a pen and wrote Mason Reed. Mason stared at the name. Drew noticed. What? Still me? Drew stopped writing and looked at him. Mason, I chose you when we were barely speaking. What makes you think I would change it now? Mason smiled. I just wanted to hear you say it. Drew shook his head. You are exhausting. And yet, apparently medically important. Drew laughed. Mason stood, walked to one of the boxes near the kitchen, and pulled out a folder of his own. What are you doing? Drew asked. Something I should have done weeks ago. Mason found his personal information form and sat down again. His mother was listed as his emergency contact. She lived more than 1,000 miles away, and Mason loved her deeply, but he finally understood that the line on the form was not a ranking of love. It was a question of trust, proximity, and who he wanted beside him when life stopped going according to plan. He crossed out the old entry carefully, updated the information, and wrote Andrew Collins. Drew watched without speaking. Mason placed the pen down. There. Drew looked at the form, then at Mason. You did not have to do that. I know. Mason smiled. That is why it matters. For a moment, the townhouse became completely quiet. No hospital monitors. No rain against dark windows. No unanswered questions. Just sunlight, moving boxes, cooling coffee, and two men who had finally stopped making each other guess. Drew turned his hand palm up between them. Mason looked at it and remembered the hospital room, the narrow space between their fingers, and how impossible that distance had once seemed. He placed his hand in Drew's. Their fingers closed together. Naturally. Still okay with being my emergency contact? Drew asked. Mason squeezed his hand. Only if I get to choose you too. Drew smiled. Deal. Mason looked around the unfinished room and thought about all the years they had spent waiting for certainty before speaking honestly. He understood now that certainty had never been the requirement. Courage was. Love had been there in coffee orders, long drives, spare keys, groceries left outside a door, and every quiet act that said, I am here. But nobody should have to spend years guessing whether they are loved. Mason looked at Drew and smiled. You know what the best part is? What? We do not need an emergency to tell the truth anymore. Drew rested his shoulder gently against Mason's. Then let us not wait for one. And sitting there among unopened boxes in a home still waiting to be built, Mason finally understood that choosing someone was not one grand decision. It was something you did again tomorrow, and the day after that, for as long as both of you kept choosing each other.